show you my Washington Wizards hoodie there, as you refer to it. No, 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 no. You see that? Can you see my Washington Wizards? Big win last night. It actually has been washed. It's holding up, though. Thank you. Beautiful. Bye-bye.
Get a quick check.
Check 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 5, 4, 815 Connecticut Avenue, Northwest, Washington, D.C. Testing 2, 3, 4, 5, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Testing 2, 3. Good. You all right? Testing 2, 3, 4, 5, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. This press conference will begin soon.
This isn't the real thing. We're going to start in about 5 minutes. Just letting you guys know.
much, so I'll be introducing you then.
You have a tough job.
Yeah.
And what are your polls?
We just finished one, 37 Republican, who's not known at all, 34. And my opponent is Governor 11.
Amazing.
You guys all run there.
Oh, jumbo primary.
Oh, so the top two finishers run in the general? I like your chances.
Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah, that helps.
Outstanding.
Yeah, so that's the thing is, so long as I can
Yeah, we got some more.
Dave would have to overcome the spread that I have on him right now. So,
Ellen, you front and center. Okay.
okay, just signal, wave and all do all that kind of stuff. Yeah, I still got work. And as I said, and we knew at the convention going in that he was hoping to come up with the endorsement, which meant the company 60% of delegates. And it's not as if I've been accountable.
Yeah.
Good afternoon, everyone. Sorry about that. Let's start it again. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Carl Racine. I'm the Attorney General of the District of Columbia and have the pleasure and privilege to serve as co-chair of the Democratic Attorney Generals Association. Thank you for attending this afternoon's session. We know that last week the President of the United States indicated that he very much wanted to speak with governors and attorneys general about gun violence and what solutions could be out there in order to make America safe. Unfortunately, the president, at least with respect to the attorney generals, opted to only meet with Republican attorney general. The Democratic attorney general also have a strong perspective, and we'd like to share that with you this afternoon. So what you're going to hear are statements from a number of my colleagues about what they're doing in their states to curb gun violence. And we're also very fortunate to have with us the Vice President of the NEA, Becky Pringle, and a gun violence survivor, Mr. Greg Gibson. From the perspective of the District of Columbia, I want to inform the audience today that the District of Columbia, the mayor, Mayor Bowser, submitted legislation today that would unquestionably render bump stocks and the equivalents illegal. Now, under the District of Columbia law and because of our peculiar jurisdiction, we're not a state, after the council deliberates and passes the law and the mayor signs the law, that legislation will go before Congress. And Congress will have an opportunity essentially to review and advise as to whether it agrees with DC's legislation. And so in some ways, Congress will not be able to escape the dialogue in regards to bump stocks. With that, it's my pleasure to introduce my co-chair from Oregon, Ellen Rosenblum. Ellen?
Thank you, Carl, and good afternoon. Thank you all for joining us here today. As the Attorney General of Oregon, the recent Parkland shooting really hit home. We too in Oregon have experienced unacceptable gun violence that has grabbed national attention in high schools, community college, and even at a major shopping center. What sets Oregon and many of the states joining me today apart is that we took action in the wake of tragedy. We listened to the survivors and law enforcement officers, and we worked with our state legislatures to make changes and see good laws enforced. But despite some progress in many states, there are still too many situations when people who should not have access to guns are able to access them. I'm proud that in Oregon, we were the first state in the nation to pass stronger gun laws after the terror of Florida. Last week, the Oregon legislature closed the boyfriend loophole, making it harder for abusers and stalkers to own firearms. With bipartisan support, we were able to fix this loophole that endangers too many Oregonians, especially victims of domestic violence. Progress is happening now. Take a minute to reflect on just some of what is happening. In Washington, Attorney General Ferguson, who couldn't join us today, is working to pass common sense gun bills in Washington, including setting more reasonable age limits on gun ownership and banning high cap magazines. In 5 states, we have something that's known as the Extreme Risk Protective Order, the ERPO, which allows guns to be taken by court order from those at extreme risk of harming themselves or others. And in 2015, Oregon was the 8th state to expand our background check system beyond federal equivalents. And there are quite a number of other states that have done that as well. Before we move on to our next speakers, I will conclude as follows. I want to make sure this message is heard loud and clear. There are solutions to prevent gun violence, and we need all the parties at the table to move this issue forward. As we look toward November, the election being only 253 days away, this issue matters to the voters, and we want to make sure they know that Democratic AGs are fighting on the right side of history. We will never forget Parkland, Las Vegas, Pulse, Sandy Hook, Umpqua Community College in Roseburg, Oregon, and the everyday gun violence that kills more than 90 Americans every day, including 7 children every day. We are here to say enough, and most importantly, let's get to work. And now I would like to introduce the Vice President of the National Education Association, Becky Pringle. Thank you.
As we still mourn the loss of far too many children's lives, as an 8th grade teacher, I tried to imagine how I could manage experiments with middle schoolers and the expectation that I was now being asked to make a split-second decision to take a life. But I wanted to know what others thought about it. So when I was in Columbus, Ohio this past weekend, I asked high school history teacher Gina Davis, do you want to be armed with a gun in your classroom? Absolutely not, was her very quick answer. She went on to talk about all the things that she did as a teacher that didn't fall into her job description. Hemming a prom gown, driving students home when nobody is there to pick them up, putting Band-Aids on boo-boos. But not this. No. How would that even work? Would I have time to get my gun out of a lockbox where firearms are supposed to be kept for safekeeping? Would I carry it on me with easy access for me to use against others, or others against me or my students? No. The president and politicians who, instead of focusing on changing laws that allow dangerous people to carry dangerous semi-automatic military-grade weapons, they are shifting the responsibility to me. No, I will not add that to the list of things I do beyond teaching my students. And after all, that's not what the students who survived yet another horrific assault of gun violence asked of their elected officials. They didn't want more guns in their schools. They didn't want their schools to be turned into prisons and their teachers and other educators to be turned into prison guards, armed prison guards. And they didn't want to be prisoners. They were very clear. What they want is common sense gun reform. They don't want assault weapons that are designed to kill as many people as possible in their schools. I am so proud of our students. As the men and women who have dedicated their lives to educating America's children, we know they are smart enough, they are articulate enough, and they are determined enough to say, never again. To make their case and not give up until the adults in the system do something to protect them. And I am so proud of the creative and caring educators who are saying to politicians who haven't spent a day in their classrooms, hashtag, arm me with resources, arm me with social workers, arm me with counselors, arm me with small enough class sizes so I can attend to every student's needs. As the vice president, of the National Education Association, I am proud to stand with these attorneys general who are listening. They're not waiting for permission. They have committed to do something to keep our students and educators safe. On behalf of the 3 million members of the NEA, I say thank you.
Thank you so much, Becky. My name is Maura Healy. I'm the Massachusetts Attorney General, and I am so delighted to be here today, joined by my colleagues who represent the chief law enforcement officers of their state. First of mind for so many of us is the public health and public safety of the residents in our states. And I'm so glad to be with them here today and with them in this fight. I want to thank the National Education Association and all of education and teachers who are standing with us across the country at this time. And especially want to acknowledge our students who are out there who have really shown us the way over the last several days. I also want to remember and reach out to all the survivors who are out there. You'll hear shortly from a dear friend of mine from Massachusetts, Greg Gibson, who lost both his sister and his son to gun violence. Today is about keeping young people safe. This is about parents who've been asking me, what do I tell my 6-year-old about an active shooter drill? This is not the America we grew up in. This isn't acceptable. All of us in Massachusetts and across this country are grieving with the people of Parkland and the 17 families down there and the many more affected by this terrible, terrible incident. All of us are so inspired by the courageous students who are speaking out and standing up. They've cut right through the talking points, the cynicism, the efforts by the gun lobby to stick to the same tired old script. Because for these incredible Parkland students, sending thoughts and prayers and just waiting for the next shooting isn't enough. They know the facts, they've cut through the BS, and the facts are clear. The facts are that strong gun laws save lives. Universal background checks save lives. Banning large capacity magazines and assault weapons save lives. That's what the overwhelming majority of Americans on both sides of the political aisle want. That's what most of us in law enforcement want. And it is time, once and for all, to put politics aside and come together to act and save lives. You know, in Massachusetts, we have the lowest or one of the lowest rates of gun deaths in America. And it's no mystery why. It's because we have strong laws on the books and we enforce them. We're one of 7 states, plus the District of Columbia, with an assault weapons ban. Passed in 1998 by a Democratic legislature and signed by a Republican governor in response in part to the school shooting that took Greg's son's life. After another shooting, the Orlando shooting, which was a shooting with an AR-15, we stepped up once again our efforts to enforce the law. But you know what happened in response? The NRA sued me. And 2 weeks ago, we were in court trying to stop the NRA from dismantling gun laws that have proven safe and effective in Massachusetts. As A.G. Racine mentioned, we were looking forward to the opportunity to share our experience as attorneys general with the president. I was looking forward to reporting on our experience in Massachusetts and the kind of laws that we have on the books and the effect they have. Unfortunately, he wouldn't meet with us. And I think that's a real shame. Because while I'm glad that the president finally agrees we should improve background checks and ban bump stocks, the rest of his ideas and the NRA's are frankly terrible. Donald Trump and the NRA want to lay public health and public safety at the door of teachers, students, and parents around this country. It is cowardly and an abdication of responsibility. They say the only way to keep schools safe is to arm teachers. Every teacher I've talked to, and the representatives here from our largest teacher organizations agree that's a terrible idea. There should be fewer guns around kids because more than 30 studies have shown that places with more guns are less safe. We should arm our teachers with computers and books and counselors. The only interest this serves is the gun lobbies, and frankly, the NRA is looking to boost the sales and profits of gun manufacturers around this country. That's what's driving this. They say gun deaths are about mental health. I'm proud to support red flag laws. But there's one thing that links all of these shootings, and that is guns. They say cities with strong gun laws have high gun violence rates. I'll tell you what that is about. It's because we need national reform. In Massachusetts, most of the guns used in our crimes come from other states. They say assault weapons are no different than other guns. Then why do mass shooters use them? Because they're designed for military use to kill as many people as possible, as quickly as possible. Our military has them, we shouldn't. But when it comes to any proposal, we should get the facts. And I think everyone agrees with that. Unfortunately, the gun lobby has blocked Congress and blocked the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention from even studying gun violence or the steps we could take to prevent it. Last week, Greg Gibson wrote a powerful piece in the New York Times that I encourage you all to read, and he spoke about the club that no one wants to join. The club that grows by more than 1 million people every year, with 35,000 gun deaths, more than 100,000 wounds, hundreds of thousands of family members, friends, coworkers, neighbors, whose lives have been forever shaped and altered, turned upside down by a gun. 25 years ago, Greg's son Galen was killed in a school shooting by a semi-automatic weapon. Since then, Greg has been an advocate for common sense reforms and for survivors, not just in Massachusetts, but around the country. Greg tells me, if we wanted it to stop, we'd do something about it. And today, joining with my Democratic AGs, joining with educators around this country, joining with students, and on behalf of the families who've lost members to gun violence, on behalf of the more than 90 Americans who will die today at the hands of a gun, and on behalf of Galen Gibson and the brave students of Parkland, it's time for us all to come together and do something. I introduce Greg Gibson from Gloucester, Massachusetts.
Thank you, Maura. Yes. 25 years ago, my son was killed in a school shooting. And in essence, I've been standing here for 25 years, closely watching nothing happen, or watching a lot happen, most of which has to do with people getting killed by guns and politicians doing nothing about it. I'm happy to say that for the first time in quite a while, I feel a little more hopeful about this situation. I'm tremendously proud of the job that our Attorney General and the lawmakers of Massachusetts have done to prevent gun violence with sensible laws. And I'm inspired by the kids of Parkland. I think they're bringing a completely different tenor to this debate. These kids have never known in their lives a day that the threat of school shooting wasn't present. Just like people of my generation huddled under their desks fearing atomic bombs, these kids are growing up with this reality, and they're the ones who are going to change it. So I have hope, and I hope you do. And I hope all of America can start voting for people who understand that sensible gun laws save lives. Thank you.
My name's Javier Becerra. I'm the Attorney General from the state of California. I'm proud to stand with everyone who's here, who's, as a law enforcement officer, done the job, or as someone who's a teacher or a parent. has had to face these situations. If I had had a chance to speak to President Trump, I would have said two things to him. One, the time for talk is over. It's time to act. And two, I would have said there are many innovations that many of our states have already implemented. California has had universal background checks for decades. We banned bump stocks decades ago. We were the first to actually call for licensing for anyone who wanted to carry a weapon in a concealed position. We did that not a decade ago, not a couple of decades ago. We did that a century ago. And we're doing something in California that I would have told the president we should all do. And that is, we have a program in place that allows us to recover weapons that are being held by people who have demonstrated they are no longer worthy of possessing these weapons because they have committed felonies and are dangerous people. Last month, special agents from the Department of Justice in the state of California went to collect 4 weapons from an individual who had felony convictions. Those 4 weapons he had registered, but had not turned in. So my special agents went in to go collect them. By the time we had finished, we had collected 28 weapons from this individual. 13 of them were assault-style weapons like the ones used in the last couple of weeks in Florida to kill 17 people. 11 of them were what we call ghost guns, which are manufactured by individuals themselves by ordering parts, and therefore, as a result of assembling separate parts on their own, they essentially build a weapon without a serial number, and you can never trace these weapons. This individual, on top of having these 28 weapons, 2 of which were also machine guns, which could fire at a rate of 300 rounds or more per minute, also had in his home 65,000 rounds of ammunition. All of this by an individual who was a felon and under California's laws was not allowed to possess a weapon. Time to talk is done. Time to act. You don't have to invent the wheel, Mr. President. There are a whole bunch of us who can tell you all the good ways that we can try to save lives and give people like Mr. Gibson a chance to believe that we're going to try to save someone else's son or daughter in the future. We can do this. We know how. Get politics out of the way and get the NRA out of the way, and we will succeed. I now have the pleasure of introducing my colleague and friend from the state of Pennsylvania, Attorney General Josh Shapiro.
Thank you, Javier, and thank you for your leadership in California and here in Washington. It's an honor to be with my colleagues in the NEA and most especially Mr. Gibson. The events of Parkland were obviously horrifying to all of us, and watching the images and videos that day made me sad and made me angry. But I've also been inspired by the movement. I've been inspired by the students. And something about this just feels different. I know for sure that our kids should never have to experience the kind of fear that those Parkland students did, or witness that kind of violence when they go to school. Listen, I respect and I defend the Second Amendment rights of Pennsylvanians, of hunters and sportsmen and law-abiding citizens that seek to protect themselves. And I appreciate the important role that guns and hunting play in the culture and the fabric of everyday Pennsylvanians. But I also respect the right of Pennsylvanians to feel safe in their communities, to not get shot in their schools or shot on their street corners. And I fight to defend them each day as well. I am moved by the students who have spoken up and demanded common sense from their leadership. These children lost 17 of their classmates and friends. They are right to be angry. They are right to use their voices and speak up. They've inspired my daughter and my 3 sons to do more. And they've inspired millions more. This is a movement moment in our country, and it is being led by these young voices. And it's time for politicians to listen. I was hoping one of those people to listen would have been the President of the United States. I would have liked to have had a respectful conversation with him, but unfortunately, he rescinded that invitation. I would have assumed, as the chief legal officers of our respective states and commonwealths, that he would have wanted to know what we thought about how to address gun violence throughout this country. Because we know that in Pennsylvania, for example, there are 520 gun murders each and every year. A person is murdered with a gun in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania every 17 hours. I would have said, Mr. President, it does not have to be this way. That this is a conscious choice that you and policymakers make to quite literally do nothing and allow this killing to continue in Pennsylvania and across our country. I would have said, Mr. President, we should come together and all support universal background checks, and we can all agree we shouldn't have military-grade weapons on the streets of Philadelphia or Pittsburgh or anywhere in between. That we should get behind red flag laws, that we should figure out a way to create a greater nexus between our public safety and our public health communities so they can share information to stop these kinds of killings. I would have told them about the gun violence task force that operates in the city of Philadelphia that we lead, that takes illegal guns off our streets each and every day and gets it out of the hands of people who shouldn't have them. I would have said, Mr. President, together with 16 of my colleagues, we respect states' rights, which is why we don't think that a state with no laws and no rules about concealed carry should undermine the laws of Massachusetts or Pennsylvania or the District of Columbia or anywhere in between when we want to stand up and protect our state's rights to concealed carry. And I would have said we need more data. We need gun tracing databases to be able to follow where these guns are coming from and stop the flow of illegal guns in our communities. But most importantly, I would have said, Mr. President, together with my colleagues, we all agree it does not have to be this way. That together we should rise up above the politics and heed the words of these young people and meet their courage head on and do more as Americans, do more as leaders, and make sure that we save lives in this country. That's what I would have said. I would have been proud to say it with my colleagues. And at this time, it's my pleasure to introduce the Attorney General of Rhode Island, Peter Kilmartin. Peter?
Well, first and foremost, I just want to extend my sincerest condolences to the victims and the families of Parkland and every other needless and ridiculous tragedy that's happened across this country for seemingly the past 20 years, if not more. We all should be saying our prayers for them. You know, I spent 24 years in law enforcement. I saw my share of gun violence firsthand on the street, then and there. As AG in Rhode Island in my 8th year now, we are the DA. We've prosecuted those gun violence cases. I've hugged the families like Greg's and cried with them. My dad was a school teacher. I hear his voice from his grave saying how absurd it is to say armed school teachers. But with all of that experience, I have not witnessed or experienced the carnage that innocent children from all over this country have had to live through. I know what's embedded in my memories that I'll never forget. I can just imagine what will be embedded in theirs for the rest of their lives. 9 times since 2015 alone, we have had to put our flags at half-staff because of needless gun violence, mass shootings. It's time this nation, this Congress, this president stop and listen to the children and the victims families for their common sense, real life pain as to what's happening across this country. We need to listen to them and not the outrageous proclamations of the NRA leadership. You know, our Constitution's an interesting and dynamic document, but not everything's in it an absolute. We all applaud the right of First Amendment speech, but the court has said you can't yell fire in a movie theater if there is none. Justice Scalia has said in the Heller decision that the right to bear arms is not absolute. Common sense measures to control gun violence, stop the access to assault weapons of war, keep the guns out of the hands of those individuals who want to do carnage against their fellow human beings needs to be done. You know, as a legislator, I passed gun locker laws in Rhode Island to keep guns out of the hands of kids that had them in their household. I've supported legislation throughout the years to ban assault weapons in Rhode Island. Last year, working with domestic violence advocates, our legislature and us, we passed bills to keep guns out of the hands of domestic violence abusers. Just today, my governor signed an executive order on red flags. But you know what? We need the legislation passed, and that has the full and unanimous support of the chiefs of police of the state of Rhode Island. All reasonable measures. It doesn't stop anyone from owning a gun in their home. It doesn't stop you from going as a family to a gun club. But these multi-pronged efforts will stop the carnage that we are experiencing on a daily basis in our cities, in our towns, in our urban centers, in our suburban areas, and across this country. Someone said it's time to act. It's not. It's past time to act. We need to listen to the children who, in their innocent wisdom, are speaking so coherently. We need to listen to the Mr. Gibsons of the world who are taking this and trying to get some help for someone else so they don't live what they're living through. The bottom line, access to guns does kill innocent people. It kills innocent kids. It ruins innocent families. And it is past time for this country to act. With that, it's my pleasure to introduce to you the Attorney General from the great state of Maine, Janet Mills.
Thank you. As a former long-term district attorney for 3 counties in central Maine, as a homicide prosecutor, many is the time that I have held the hand of family members who've lost others to gun violence, whether homicide, aggravated assault, whether suicide, and reckless use of firearms. I've held the hand of the woman, the young widow, whose husband, police officer, my detective, was shot through the heart with a .30-30 when out on a mission assigned by me. Shot by a deranged individual who had no business having possession of any firearm. I also have taken part in forming legislation to allow courts to take guns away from individuals facing protection orders, domestic violence orders, and people who have been involuntarily committed because they are dangerous to themselves or others because of severe and persistent mental health issues. We can't do these things without working across the aisle, without talking to one another, without a dialogue, talk about what is a tactical weapon of war and what we should do with them. And now it's more than a public safety issue, more than a public health issue. Now it's an education issue. And it's come into our schools time and time again. My mother was a teacher for 37 years. I cannot imagine her having had to deal with the kind of violence that we've seen in schools now all too often. And it's time for all of us to talk, to engage in a substantial, significant dialogue about what to do to prevent gun violence and to make our children safe in their schools and their homes. We need to focus on teacher-student ratios, not teacher-gun ratios. That which affects one school in Parkland, Florida, affects all of our schools and puts fear in the hearts of all students in every state. So it is time to talk and to become unified in taking action, to arrive at common sense measures, rational common sense measures to keep dangerous weapons away from the hands of those who engage in domestic violence, those who are dangerous because of severe and persistent mental illnesses, and look at regulating tactical military weapons. Mr. President, why don't you talk to us?
Good afternoon. I'm Brian Frosch. I'm the Attorney General of Maryland, and our country is alone in the world. We're alone among industrialized nations that have a public health problem related to gun violence. It's partly because we have more than 300 million guns in private hands. And I served in the Maryland Senate for 20 years. And in 2013, after the massacre of children and teachers at Sandy Hook in Newtown, I sponsored legislation and worked with our governor, Martin O'Malley, to get an omnibus bill with best practices for gun safety enacted. Best practices including fingerprint licensing to purchase a handgun, complete background checks, bans on assault weapons and large capacity magazines, taking guns away from the most dangerous people in our state. And not surprisingly, after that legislation was passed, we were sued by the NRA. And I had the pleasure of getting elected Attorney General the following year and being able to defend that legislation. They sued us, among many other things, for our ban on assault weapons and large capacity magazines. And a year ago, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fourth Circuit, in a ringing opinion, said that assault rifles, like the AR-15, are weapons of war. They're not covered by the Second Amendment. We know that you can accomplish progress like that in states across the country if our political leaders have the courage to do it. But when we continue to witness massacres like the one that occurred at Parkland, and the President of the United States and the NRA say that the answer is the hair of the dog, it's a disgrace. I don't want Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid teaching my kids. I want Becky Pringle. I don't want people walking around on the streets, thousands and millions of them with concealed weapons. That's not going to lead to better public safety. We know what the answers are. They can be accomplished within the Second Amendment, and we need our political leaders to stand up for us. If they don't, I hope that in this next election and the one following it, we get political leaders who will. Thank you. And it's my pleasure to introduce the Attorney General of the Commonwealth of Virginia, my friend, Mark Herring.
Thank you, Brian. When I hear the stories of those like Greg Gibson, it tears my heart and reminds me of the conversations I've had with so many Virginians whose families have been devastated by gun violence. And when you're the Attorney General, or really any elected official, it is so important to be able to look them in the eye and assure them that you are doing everything you can to make sure that another family doesn't feel the same kind of pain. And if there are still elected officials out there who fear the political wrath of the gun lobby, you need to get over that, because lives are at stake. And people are dying preventable deaths every day because of inaction on gun safety. And you can take on the gun lobby and win. I am fresh off an election, a re-election, this past November in Virginia. And I feel like I've got the freshest perspective on the state of the power of the gun lobby, political power. The NRA is headquartered in Virginia, and they targeted me for defeat. They called me one of the most anti-gun lawmakers in Virginia history. They put $700,000 into ads attacking me during the campaign. They put another $700,000 in a contribution to the Republican Attorneys General Association in order to benefit my opponent's campaign. They ran direct mail to Virginia voters, and I won by 7%. The gun lobby's political influence is breaking under the weight of its own intransigence, because they will not even consider reasonable measures that are supported by a lot of Americans, including their own members. And I've also seen the enthusiasm gap flip. And some of my most dedicated volunteers were working on the campaign because they wanted action taken to stop gun violence. And some of the most enthusiastic responses I got from voters were when I talked about the need to address gun safety. The growing fraternity of parents, students, law enforcement, and communities who have had to deal with the pain of a mass shooting continues to grow. And not just the mass shootings, but the ones that happen every single day. And this growing fraternity is going to insist that elected officials take action. And so, to the elected officials out there, I would say make sure that you are listening to your constituents and that you are responsive and you do what you know in your heart will make the communities safer. To the voters out there, make sure your voice is heard. And if you want action to stop gun violence, make sure you know where candidates stand and vote for it. Thank you all very much, and I think we may have, do we still have time for a few questions? Okay.
We have time for about 2 questions. If anybody has a question, we have a microphone that we can pass around if anybody has a question. If not, we can also do pull-asides separately.
Inside.
Yes, inside.
All right.
All right.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, everybody.